Okay, so, wow, you've been diving deep into 19th and 20th century Africa. This is going to be fascinating. You know, when I was looking at all the materials he sent over, something really jumped out at me. This period, it's often called the Scramble for Africa. And honestly, the name is pretty spot on.
Yeah, it really is. It's like, imagine European powers just all rushing to claim these huge chunks of the African continent, almost like some giant game of Risk, but
Yeah,
like with real-world consequences.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack exactly how this scramble unfolded. We're going to focus on the impact of three kind of key figures: Cecil Rhodes, King Leopold II of Belgium, and Frederick Lugard. And their actions had these ripple effects, not just across Africa, but globally,
Yeah, their impact is still felt today,
shaping the political and economic landscape for generations to come.
for sure. We'll see how each of them represents a different facet of this era, ambition, exploitation, and the complexities of these colonial policies.
Yeah. Now, to really get this, we need to understand the historical backdrop, right? So it's the late 19th, early 20th century. Why this sudden frenzy for African territory?
Well, think of it like this. Europe is going through this massive transformation, the second industrial revolution. Technology's booming, factories are churning out goods, and suddenly they need new markets to sell all this stuff. Plus, they need this steady supply of raw materials to keep the whole machine running.
So they basically saw Africa as this giant treasure chest, ripe for the taking.
Unfortunately, yeah, that's a big part of it. But it wasn't just about economics. Nationalism was surging. Countries were trying to flex their muscles and kind of outdo each other on the world stage. And then, to make matters worse, this dangerous idea called social Darwinism. It was gaining traction.
Social Darwinism, that whole survival of the fittest applied to entire races. It's unbelievable how such harmful ideas were used to justify exploitation.
It's truly disturbing how these flawed theories were used to dehumanize entire populations and rationalize the takeover of their lands.
Okay, so the stage is set. Europe's hungry for resources and power, armed with this dangerous ideology.
Yeah.
Enter Cecil Rhodes, our first kind of key player. And from what I've read, he was quite a character. He went to South Africa for his health and ended up a diamond magnate. Talk about a major glow-up.
Yeah, Rhodes is like the embodiment of ambition and maybe a little bit of ruthlessness, too. He saw the potential of South Africa's diamond fields and went all in. He founded the De Beers Mining Company and ended up controlling this huge chunk of global diamond production.
Imagine for a second that you controlled that much of a precious resource, the power and wealth. Must have been staggering.
It's mind-boggling, right? But Rhodes wasn't just content with diamonds. He had this grand vision of a British-controlled Africa, stretching all the way from Cape to Cairo, linked by railway.
Wow. Talk about thinking big.
Yeah.
So how did he go about turning this vision into reality?
Well, he was a master strategist, using both political maneuvering and outright expansion. He became prime minister of the Cape Colony and implemented policies that favored British settlers, often at the expense of the African population. He also founded the British South Africa Company, which led to the colonization of territories that were later named Rhodesia.
Yes.
After him.
So he's shaping policies, expanding territories, all in service of this British-dominated Africa. What was the impact on the people actually living there?
Well, that's where Rhodes' legacy gets complicated. On one hand, there was infrastructure development, railways, roads, and the like. But all of this came at a steep price for the indigenous populations. Land dispossession, forced labor, and the curtailing of African rights became the norm. And sadly, his policies laid the groundwork for the apartheid system that would later grip South Africa.
Progress for some, oppression for others. Definitely not the kind of legacy I'd want. Speaking of controversial figures, our next key player is King Leopold II of Belgium. And this is where things take a truly shocking turn. We're talking about a king owning a colony.
Yeah.
As his private property.
Seriously? It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. Leopold was incredibly shrewd, and he knew how to manipulate the system to his advantage. He used the Berlin Conference, which was supposed to regulate colonization in Africa, to gain control of the Congo Basin. And this massive territory, larger than Belgium itself, became his personal domain, the Congo Free State.
Can you imagine the audacity? A king just claiming an entire country for himself, and he tried to sell it as this philanthropic endeavor, claiming he was bringing civilization to the Congo. But come on, was that just a smokescreen for greed?
You nailed it. Leopold's primary goal was to extract wealth from the Congo. Rubber, ivory, whatever he could get his hands on, and to squeeze out maximum profit. His administration implemented this brutal system of forced labor. The atrocities committed in the Congo Free State are absolutely horrifying.
So Leopold's actions in the Congo, they raised this critical question about the Berlin Conference itself. if it was meant to set rules for the scramble for Africa, did it do anything to actually protect the people living there?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the Berlin Conference's failure. The conference was all about regulating European competition, dividing up Africa as if it were a pie, with absolutely no regard for the existing societies, kingdoms, communities that already called it home.
So they were basically drawing lines on a map, carving up a continent, without even considering the people who lived there. What a mess.
Exactly, and unfortunately, the consequences of those arbitrary borders are still felt today, but we'll get into that a bit later. For now, let's shift our focus to Frederick Lugard, our third key player. He offers a fascinating contrast to both Rhodes and Leopold. Lugard was a soldier and an administrator, and he's known for his role in shaping British colonial policy, particularly in Nigeria.
So not a businessman driven by profit like Rhodes.
Yeah.
Or a king with a personal colony like Leopold. What was Lugard's approach?
Well, Lugard was a proponent of indirect rule, a system that became a hallmark of British colonialism in many parts of Africa.
For those of us who aren't familiar with that term, can you break down what indirect rule actually means?
Sure. It was a system where the British governed through existing local power structures. So instead of imposing direct British rule, they would work through local chiefs, emirs, other traditional leaders. And these leaders would then act as intermediaries, implementing British policies at the local level.
On the surface, it sounds like it might have been less disruptive to local customs and traditions. Was that the idea behind it?
There were definitely arguments made along those lines. Proponents of indirect rule believed that it would minimize resistance from the local population, keep administrative costs low, and ultimately create a more stable system.
But I'm guessing there were some major downsides to this approach, too.
Absolutely. One of the biggest criticisms is that it reinforced existing hierarchies and power imbalances. It could also exacerbate ethnic divisions, as the British often played favorites, empowering certain groups over others in the long run. This created tensions and conflicts that continued long after independence.
So a clever system on paper, but with potential for some serious long-term negative consequences. How did Lugard's ideas actually play out in Nigeria?
Well, Lugard served as High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria and later became Governor General of all of Nigeria. He was instrumental in uniting the North and South under a single administration. And his implementation of indirect rule had a profound impact on the country's political development, an impact that continues to be abated to this day.
It's fascinating how each of these figures, Rhodes, Leopold, and Lugard, approached colonization in such different ways. But it's important to remember that they were all operating within a larger system, a system driven by the economics of imperialism, competition between European powers, and those prevailing ideologies of the time, like social Darwinism.
You're absolutely right. To truly grasp the motivations and impacts of these individuals, we need to constantly connect their stories back to this broader context of the scramble for Africa, their choices, their policies, their successes, and their failures. They all played out on a stage set by these larger forces.
And speaking of that broader context, I think it's time we circle back to the Berlin Conference. We touched on it briefly earlier, but it's worth diving a bit deeper into how this event shaped the rules of the game for the scramble for Africa.
The Berlin Conference, held from 1884 to 1885, was a pivotal moment. It was essentially a gathering of European powers to formally regulate their colonization and trade in Africa. Think of it as the moment when the scramble went from a chaotic free-for-all to a more structured, but no less exploitative system. They established rules for claiming territories, recognizing existing claims, and so on.
But as we saw with Leopold II and the Congo, these rules didn't do much to protect the people living there.
Exactly. One of the most glaring flaws of the Berlin Conference was its complete disregard for the existing societies and political structures of Africa. They were dividing up a continent amongst themselves, drawing borders with little to no consideration for the people who already called it home.
So it wasn't really about protecting Africa at all. It was about preventing European powers from fighting amongst themselves over Africa.
You could say that. It was about maintaining a certain order and stability. But that order ultimately benefited the colonizers, not the colonized.
And as you mentioned earlier, the decisions made at that conference have had some pretty long-lasting consequences. I mean, just look at the map of Africa today. Many of those borders, drawn by European powers over a century ago, are still in place.
That's the enduring legacy of the Berlin Conference, those arbitrary borders. They often grouped together rival ethnic groups or divided existing communities, creating tensions and conflicts that persist to this day. It's a stark reminder of how decisions made in a conference room, far removed from the realities of life in Africa, can have a profound and lasting impact.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at the ambitions of Cecil Rhodes, the brutal exploitation under King Leopold II, and the complexities of Frederick Lugard's system of indirect rule.
We've seen how each of these individuals approached colonization in their own way, shaping events on the ground, but always within the context of this larger system of imperialism.
And we've started to unpack the profound impact of the Berlin Conference, an event that essentially formalized the scramble for Africa, and left a legacy of arbitrary borders that continue to shape the continent today.
But this is just the beginning. Now it's time to zoom out and explore the wider consequences of the scramble for Africa, the economic exploitation, the cultural disruptions, and the political legacies that continue to resonate throughout the continent.
All right, buckle up, listener. We're about to dive even deeper into the heart of this complex and consequential era. So we've talked about these big personalities, Rhodes, Leopold, Lugard. But now I'm really interested in the bigger picture. What was the overall impact of new imperialism on Africa, beyond just the actions of a few individuals?
That's where it gets really interesting, because we start to see these long-lasting effects that are still felt today. One of the most significant impacts was economic exploitation. Imagine all the resources from the land you're studying being siphoned off, fueling European industries, while local communities struggled.
So it's not just about individual figures making their fortunes. It's about a whole system designed to extract wealth from Africa.
Exactly. Think about it. Raw materials like rubber, diamonds, gold, copper, all flowing out of Africa, making European economies richer. But what were African communities getting in return for all this wealth being taken from their land?
That's what I'm wondering. Were they at least getting fair prices for these resources? Was there any investment in local development?
Unfortunately, not really. The colonial powers weren't exactly known for their fair trade practices. They paid as little as possible for these resources, and the profits rarely benefited the African workers, who were often toiling under brutal conditions.
It's like this giant vacuum cleaner.
Yeah.
Sucking up resources and leaving behind poverty, underdevelopment.
Pretty much. The economic systems put in place during this period were designed to keep Africa as a source of cheap labor and raw materials, not a competitor on the global stage. And sadly, the effects of this economic exploitation are still being felt today. Many African countries are still struggling to break free from these patterns of dependency that were established during the colonial era.
It's a tragic story of lost potential. The generations deny the chance to build a better future for themselves. But the impact of imperialism wasn't just economic, was it? It had a profound effect on African cultures and societies as well.
Absolutely. European colonization brought about major disruptions to traditional societies, cultures, and languages across Africa. They imposed new systems of education, often with an underlying goal to civilize the natives. Missionary activities led to the conversion of many Africans to Christianity, sometimes through force, sometimes through persuasion.
It's interesting to think about the role of education. On one hand, access to education can be empowering, a path to a better future. But in this context, it was often used as a tool to undermine African cultures and replace them with European values.
Exactly. It wasn't about empowering people. It was about assimilating them, creating a class of Africans who would be more European in their thinking and behavior, making them easier to control.
So it's a pattern of loss of land, loss of economic control, loss of cultural identity. The consequences just keep piling up.
And we can't forget about the political consequences. Remember those arbitrary borders drawn by European powers during the Berlin Conference? Those lines on a map, they've had a lasting impact on the political landscape of Africa.
You're right. We talked about how those borders often group together rival ethnic groups or divided existing communities. Did this lead to conflict and instability?
Absolutely. Many of the political challenges facing Africa today can be traced back to these arbitrary borders. They created divisions, sparked conflicts, and made it incredibly difficult to build cohesive and stable nation-states. It's a stark reminder of how the decisions made by those European powers, sitting in that conference room, continue to reverberate through history.
It's almost unbelievable how decisions made over 100 years ago can still have such a powerful influence on the lives of people today. It makes you really appreciate the weight of history and the responsibility we have to learn from it.
I agree. And as we delve deeper into this history, it becomes clear that the legacy of imperialism is incredibly complex and multifaceted. It's not a simple story of good versus evil or winners and losers. It's a story of interconnectedness, unintended consequences, and the enduring struggle for power, justice, and self-determination.
So we've talked about the economic exploitation, the cultural disruptions, the political legacies. Are there any other long-term impacts of this era that we should be aware of? What about things like infrastructure? I know there was a lot of development during this period.
You're right, there was development, railways, roads, bridges. But even those, seemingly positive developments, need to be viewed through a critical lens. Who did these projects actually benefit? Were they designed to serve the needs of African communities? Or were they primarily meant to facilitate the extraction of resources and further enrich European powers?
That's a good point. Just because something looks like progress doesn't mean it actually benefits the people living in those areas.
Exactly. We need to consider the motivations, the context, and the long-term consequences of these developments. For example, those railways, they might have made transportation easier, but were they built with local labor under fair conditions? Did they connect African communities and stimulate local economies? Or did they primarily serve to transport resources out of the continent?
It's a reminder that we can't just look at the surface level of things. We need to dig deeper and ask those tough questions about who benefits and who pays the price. It makes me wonder what other hidden costs there might have been.
There are many, and some of the most significant are less tangible. We've talked about economic and political impacts, but what about the psychological impact of colonialism? Generations of Africans were told, either directly or indirectly, that their cultures, their languages, their ways of life were inferior.
Wow, I hadn't really thought about that. To have your own culture and identity constantly denigrated, that must have had a devastating impact on people's sense of self-worth.
Absolutely. This kind of psychological oppression can be just as damaging as physical violence or economic exploitation. It creates a sense of inferiority, a loss of self-esteem, and can lead to internalized racism and self-doubt. These are the kinds of wounds that run deep and can take generations to heal.
It's a lot to grapple with. But I think it's so important to acknowledge these less visible impacts. We can't truly understand the legacy of colonialism without considering the full scope of its consequences, both tangible and intangible.
I completely agree. Acknowledging the past, understanding its complexities, and learning from its mistakes is crucial to building a better future. And that includes acknowledging the trauma, the resilience, and the agency of the people who lived through these experiences. Their stories deserve to be heard and understood.
I'm realizing that this conversation is far from over. We've explored so much, but there's still so much more to learn and understand about the scramble for Africa and its enduring legacies.
That's the beauty of history. It's an ongoing conversation, an endless process of discovery and reinterpretation. As we learn more, our understanding evolves and deepens.
And as we learn more, we can also start to see how this history connects to the present, how the events of the past continue to shape the world we live in today.
Exactly. It's not just about looking back, it's about understanding how the past informs the present and how we can use that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future.
Speaking of connecting the past to the present, there's one more point I want to touch on that I found particularly fascinating in our research. It's about the role of African resistance to colonial rule. We haven't really talked about that yet.
That's a crucial aspect that we need to explore because it challenges the narrative of passive acceptance. African communities, they did not simply surrender to colonial domination. There were countless acts of resistance, both large and small, throughout this period.
So it wasn't just about European powers imposing their will. There was pushback. There was defiance. What forms did this resistance take?
It varied widely. There were large-scale armed rebellions, like the Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa, or the Herero and Namako genocide in German Southwest Africa, which were met with brutal suppression. There were also more subtle forms of resistance, like acts of civil disobedience, the preservation of cultural traditions, or the creation of underground networks of support and solidarity.
It's inspiring to hear about these acts of resistance.
Yeah.
To know that even in the face of such overwhelming power, people found ways to fight back and assert their agency.
Absolutely. These acts of resistance, both large and small, are a testament to the courage, resilience, and determination of the African people. They refused to be simply victims of history. They actively shaped it, even in the face of incredible odds.
It's a story of resilience and hope, even in the darkest of times. And it's a reminder that even the most powerful empires are not invincible. They can be challenged, they can be weakened, and they can eventually be overthrown.
Precisely. The history of colonialism is not just a story of European dominance, but also a story of African resistance and agency. And that's a story that deserves to be told and celebrated. It's a story that reminds us that even in the face of oppression, the human spirit can endure and ultimately triumph.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've gone from exploring the actions of individuals to understanding the broader systems of power at play. And now we're seeing how those systems were met with resistance and defiance. It really paints a much more complete and nuanced picture of this period.
I agree. It's a reminder that history is not a simple narrative. It's a complex tapestry of interwoven stories, perspectives, and experiences. And as we delve deeper into this history, we begin to see the world with greater clarity, understanding, and empathy.
And speaking of seeing the world with greater clarity, I think it's time we shifted our focus to the legacy of this era. We've talked about the negative impacts. But are there any positive outcomes that emerged from this tumultuous period? How did the scramble for Africa ultimately shape the continent we see today? Feels like we've uncovered so many layers of this story already. Ambition, exploitation, resistance. But as we kind of wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious about how it all ends. What's the lasting legacy of the scramble for Africa? Is it all negative? Or did any good come out of this tumultuous period?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tempting to just focus on the negatives, and there are certainly many. But it's important to remember that history is rarely black and white. There are shades of gray, unintended consequences, and even some unexpected outcomes. That can be difficult to categorize.
So it's not as simple as saying colonialism was all bad or all good.
Exactly. It's a complex tapestry of interwoven threads. We can't erase the very real harm caused by colonialism, the exploitation, the violence, the cultural disruption. But we also can't ignore the fact that the colonial period brought about certain changes that, while often serving the interests of European powers, did have lasting effects on African societies.
Can you give us an example of some of these more complex outcomes?
Sure. Take infrastructure, for example. We talked earlier about how the development of railways and roads primarily served to facilitate the extraction of resources, but those same railways and roads, they also connected different parts of the continent, facilitated trade, and ultimately played a role in shaping the economic and social landscape of post-colonial Africa.
So something that was initially designed to benefit the colonizers ended up having an impact that extended beyond their control.
Precisely. It's a reminder that history is full of unintended consequences. Another example is the introduction of Western education systems. While often used as a tool of assimilation, education also empowered some Africans to challenge colonial rule, articulate their own visions for the future, and ultimately lead the movements for independence.
That's fascinating. So even within systems of oppression, seeds of resistance and change were being sown. It reminds me of that saying, oppression breeds resistance.
Exactly. And that spirit of resistance is a crucial part of the legacy of the scramble for Africa. We've talked about the armed rebellions and the everyday acts of defiance, but that spirit lives on in the ongoing struggle for social justice, economic equality, and political self-determination across the continent.
It sounds like the legacy of this era is far from settled. It's an ongoing process, a conversation that continues to unfold in the present.
Absolutely. The past is not something we can simply leave behind. It shapes who we are, how we see the world, and the choices we make for the future. The key is to engage with this history critically, to learn from its mistakes, and to draw inspiration from the courage and resilience of those who fought for a better world.
So for our listener who's been diving deep into the history of 19th and 20th century Africa, what key takeaways would you leave them with? What's the most important thing to remember about this period and its legacy?
I think the most crucial thing to remember is that the history of the scramble for Africa is not just a story of European dominance and African victimhood. It's a far more complex and nuanced story, a story of ambition, exploitation, resistance, resilience, and the enduring human capacity for both good and evil.
It's a story that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, to acknowledge the lasting impact of colonialism, but also to recognize the agency and determination of the African people to shape their own destiny.
Exactly. And as we move forward, it's essential to approach these issues with humility, empathy, and a willingness to listen and learn from each other. Only then can we hope to create a world where the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and where all people have the opportunity to thrive.
Those are powerful words to end on. So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has not only deepened your understanding of this complex era, but also inspired you to continue exploring, questioning, and engaging with the world in a way that promotes justice, understanding, and equality.
Remember, history is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about using the lessons we've learned to create a better world for ourselves and for generations to come.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. Knowing what we know now about the long-term impacts of colonialism, how do you think we could best support the development of a more equitable and prosperous future for Africa? It's a challenging question, but an incredibly important one. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.